All right, let's talk about what we have here, the interpretive lenses, the ways we're going to interpret fairy tales. That would mean both the marketing, the products, the things that we see in everyday life, as well as the stories themselves, the narratives as they were recorded, written down, and then even up to how they come across in movies and so forth these days, sort of in the modern day versions. So as you can see, the dominant metaphor I have here is one of microscope. And you can see that in the image here, that it's like a microscope in that we can put one item under inspection and then switch the lenses that we're looking at it with, and we'll see something totally different every time we switch the lenses. So it's pretty similar to choosing different kinds of glass to look at something. And if you've done some cultural studies before, you'll recognize some of these kinds of lenses that we'll use, different approaches that we'll use to understand what exactly these stories mean. And we'll go through them one at a time. So we begin with folklorist, which is an examination of the stories as they relate to other similar stories around the world. And to make this one work, you've got to read different stories from different cultures, compare the things that are similar and come up with a list of symbols, the things called archetypes, right? The symbols that are the same across all of these stories. And the idea being that because there is such similarity in the stories, similar symbols, that must mean something about humanity. There's something generic about, I don't know, the search for a prince, or generic about having small feet. It must mean something about the nature of the human condition. And that's what a folklorist approach does. It depends heavily on the work of psychologist Carl Jung, who wrote that not only do we have an unconscious mind, conscious mind, unconscious mind, there's a collective unconsciousness, an unconsciousness for all of humanity. And it's this is what wells up and makes us tell some of the same stories everywhere else. One of the most famous folklorists was Joseph Campbell. He made a number of publications, of course, and TV specials back in the 1980s. And Joseph Campbell's work, which takes this folklorist approach and kind of establishes the principles, like there's always a hero's journey, or there's really only one story. He calls it a monomyth. Campbell's work was very explicitly the root thinking behind Star Wars. So creator George Lucas of Star Wars had Campbell in mind when he created the Star Wars mythos. And so that's where we trace all of that back to the collective unconsciousness of Carl Jung. Now, it's the one approach that you might have heard of before when it comes to fairy tales, but it's the one we're not going to do much with in this class. The reason being is that would take a wider set of reading than I think people would want to see in a program like this. A lot of direct comparison, basically a lot of slogging through things. And it also ends up at the end of the day telling us more about Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung than it does about the fairy tale sitting there in front of us. And so we're going to use these other tools to talk and learn more about the fairy tale directly. So here's one of them, a psychological approach like Carl Jung. Sigmund Freud was a psychologist you may have heard of in the context of unconsciousness or psychoanalysis, free association, dream analysis, childhood psychology, childhood sexuality, the stages of the unconsciousness. Lots of things are associated with Freud. Oedipal complex, another big one, relationship to family members. And there are a lot of good things that can come out of a Freudian analysis of any story, really, but fairy tales perhaps especially. And Freud himself, the only literary analysis he ever did was of a fairy tale. So there's precedent coming from Freud himself. And we'll learn more about Freud as we go through the class. A different kind of lens is an authorial lens, which examines who the author is and what it is about them that might be relevant for understanding the story. So in the case of the Grimms, which you see pictured here, they were academics, they were Christians, and they were nationalistic. They believed in a united Germany, which then didn't exist. And all of those things have some relevance to understanding what do these stories mean when they're written down that way by the Grimms. And the Grimms even changed their stories. You'll see more of this later. But all of this is an authorial reading, right? It's a reading that depends on knowing who the author is and a little bit about the author to make some sense of the symbols and meanings of the story. or a historical lens, which has us looking at perhaps where the story is set, the time frame that the story is set in, or perhaps when the story was written. And so if the story was written, as many of the Grimms were, for instance, around the time of Napoleon rampaging across Europe, that may tell us something about what certain symbols in the stories mean. Or if something were commonly accepted, such as the image you see here of a castle surrounded by a forest, well, the forests we think of as a romantic place, that wasn't necessarily the case in the medieval times. So forests were dangerous places. Wolves were real things in the forest. You had to watch out for robbers too. In other words, these are not necessarily symbolic representations of deeper meaning. Maybe when we see a robber or a wolf in the forest, it means literally the forest is a dangerous place, and that shouldn't be forgotten. It's not always metaphorical. The feminist approach has us examining the roles of men and women in the stories, and this sometimes gets expanded out to other such roles, cultural roles, the roles of sex and gender, roles of sexual orientation, so-called queer studies can arise out of this as well. Who's performing which role in society is a fruitful question to ask about these stories, both the film versions, as we'll see with Disney, as well as the text versions. And that brings us back to the outside of our interpretive lens view. There are some others that we'll be adding as the term goes along. It's not really done in semester format, but you'll hear a little bit about Marxism, for instance, or class and race studies. These are all different ways of asking important questions about the story that gives you a different view that you wouldn't have known about otherwise.